Today we're looking at a seven-step guide that uses Abraham's journey to explain how believers can build a lifestyle of faithful obedience and kind of navigate that balance between total spiritual surrender and material blessing. And overall, the material makes a really passionate case with these vivid personal anecdotes, but let's just dive right into the constructive feedback to maximize the reader's experience. The sequence of the seven steps currently functions more as a list of isolated principles rather than a cohesive progression from initial separation to total reliance on the Creator.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, where this manuscript really trips up is the connective tissue between those individual steps, because the text introduces these incredibly powerful, demanding concepts, like, explicitly forsaking the world in step 1 and then refusing to turn back under pressure in step 3.
Right, totally.
7 kind of imply a progression. I feel like readers are generally smart enough to understand that chapter 3 comes before chapter 4.
Well, numbering implies chronological order, absolutely. But it doesn't automatically establish causality, you know? Like if I hand you a recipe for baking a cake and step 1 is buy flour and step 2 is preheat the oven.
Yeah, okay.
You understand the physical mechanics of why one precedes the other. But in deep spiritual development, if the reader doesn't understand the psychological and theological reasons why the early struggles are required to survive the later triumphs, they miss the entire architecture of the journey. Without that causal link, they start treating the guide like a buffet.
Oh, I see. So they just pick the easy steps, skip the hard ones?
Exactly. They skip the hard ones and then wonder why their faith isn't working.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like building a bridge, you know? Right now we have these sturdy, independent pillars standing entirely isolated in the water. But the reader needs to see the roadway connecting them to understand how step 3 structurally supports step 5.
That is the perfect way to look at it. If the author wants to string those cables, they need to revise the transitions between the steps to clearly analyze that progression. Show the reader how the disciplines learned during early adversity directly enable the later steps of maintaining spiritual focus during times of abundance.
Okay, so how do we practically execute that in the manuscript? Like, I'm trying to picture what that connecting cable looks like on the actual page.
Obviously, there are a dozen different ways they could tackle this structural issue, but one highly effective route is to explicitly link step 3 to step 5. So step 3 focuses on resisting pressure, which the author illustrates beautifully with a personal story about fighting off a severe flu.
Right, the flu story.
Yeah, and then step 5 is all about honoring God with your substance and wealth.
Wait, are you saying physical endurance during an illness translates directly to financial discipline? Because on the surface, those look like two completely different pillars.
They look different, but the internal mechanism is identical. And that is exactly what the author needs to explain to the reader. The text should explicitly state that the spiritual muscle you develop when you refuse to give up during physical or emotional adversity is the exact same discipline you are going to need to avoid spiritual laziness when wealth and abundance increase.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. If you don't build the muscle to fight the flu in step 3, you will be completely crushed by the temptations of prosperity in step 5. They are tethered together.
I see the overarching design now. So if you skip the gym in chapter 3, you can't lift the weight in chapter 5. What about the end of the book? How does the author tie off the final span of this bridge?
Another concrete example of this structural linking would be to reframe step 6, which is about recognizing God as the absolute source. Like, the author uses the biblical example of Abraham refusing the king of Sodom's wealth. The author needs to frame this moment not just as another good idea, but as the narrative climax of the entire journey.
Right.
It is a massive act of defiance against worldly reliance, and the author needs to clearly explain that this level of faith only becomes possible after the reader has successfully walked out the total, grueling consecration demanded way back in step 2.
So by constantly referencing the earlier chapters, the reader finally understands how modern believers can emulate Abraham's specific, total commitment. He didn't just wake up on the mountain ready to sacrifice everything. He had to leave his homeland first.
Exactly. It transforms the manuscript from a list of 7 good ideas into a single, unbreakable chain of spiritual maturity.
Well, since the structural progression ultimately culminates in relying on God rather than riches, The manuscript contains a noticeable tonal friction between celebrating material prosperity and demanding total spiritual surrender that risks confusing the reader about the ultimate goal of faith.
Oh man, this is a massive mixed message, and it's arguably the most dangerous pitfall in this specific genre of writing. Because on one hand, the text demands that readers forsake all and separate themselves completely from worldly desires.
Yeah, but then on the very next page,
Exactly. On the very next page, it frequently highlights material success, like talking about believers being more fashionable than the world, or pointing out that Peter left a thriving commercial fishing business rather than just a leaky rowboat.
I have to admit, I was a bit confused reading through those sections myself. But isn't that the core argument of the notes here? As I understand it, the argument is that prosperity is a byproduct of obedience. But is there a risk that focusing so heavily on the hundredfold return might inadvertently encourage the exact worldly desires that step 1 tells them to abandon?
You hit the nail on the head. They aren't arguing for poverty, but the reader is experiencing intense cognitive dissonance. If you tell an audience in step 1 to radically abandon their worldly ambitions, and then spend the next 6 chapters promising a hundredfold return of material goods, you risk inadvertently encouraging that greed.
Right, it creates this unresolved tension.
Yeah, the reader starts to wonder, is the ultimate prize of this 7-step journey a deep spiritual intimacy with the Creator? Or is the prize actually just a bigger house and a better wardrobe?
That is a fascinating paradox. If I am supposed to surrender my desire for wealth, but my reward for surrendering it is more wealth, it feels like a spiritual bait and switch. So how does an author navigate that without sounding like a hypocrite to a skeptical reader?
They have to directly evaluate and debate this tension within the text itself. The worst thing the author can do is gloss over it or pretend the paradox doesn't exist. They need to clearly outline how a modern believer can balance material success with total dependence on God, without the message appearing contradictory.
Address the elephant in the room head-on. But I imagine that requires some very careful psychological framing. How do you suggest they anchor that debate so it doesn't just devolve into abstract theology?
Well, this isn't the only solution by any means, but a great starting point would be to leverage the author's own anecdote about their auto body shop. They share this very raw story about how their business consumed their life. They should explicitly contrast that personal story with the biblical story of the rich young ruler.
Let me break that down. So in the author's story, the auto body shop became an idol that distracted them from their faith, whereas the rich young ruler walked away from his faith entirely because he couldn't let go of his wealth. The outcome is similar, but the mechanics are different.
Right. And the text needs to draw a hard, bright line between the two, clarifying that the sin is not business ownership, skill, or wealth itself, but specifically the act of trusting in riches. The author needs to add a brief section interpreting the spiritual significance of forsaking material attachment.
Okay, I see.
They must clearly define the boundary between enjoying God's blessings and lusting after them.
Enjoying versus lusting? Wow, that is a very thin line to walk for a reader who is already struggling with their finances.
It is a razor-thin line, which is why the text must explicitly debate and clarify that pursuing worldly prosperity for selfish reasons is in direct conflict with true spiritual surrender. If the author just takes a few paragraphs to talk directly to the reader, to acknowledge that it is a hard needle to thread, and to contrast worldly wealth with actual spiritual blessings, the reader will feel guided rather than manipulated.
It brings a sense of safety, you know? The reader realizes the author sees the potential contradiction and is actively steering them through it. But resolving this deep tension brings us to how this material serves beginners, because the rapid escalation from foundational faith concepts to intense spiritual warfare and extreme financial sacrifice risks overwhelming readers who are new to this path.
This happens all of the time with experts. It's the curse of knowledge. I mean, the author has been walking this road for decades, so their baseline for what constitutes normal faith is incredibly high.
Yeah, way higher than the average person.
Exactly. And the weakness here is that the material jumps very quickly from beginner instructions, like simply avoiding worldly attitudes, straight into highly advanced, intense scenarios.
You're talking about the section where the author locks himself away for 3 months, right? Or the parts about confronting drunks on the street, or facing severe demonic attacks on their personal finances the moment they start tithing.
Yeah, those are massive leaps in spiritual intensity. Because the text doesn't provide a gradual on-ramp for a novice believer, it risks alienating the exact audience it's trying to help.
Let's look closely at the section discussing these extreme faith actions. Building on that point, how can the author ensure that a reader with only a basic understanding of faith doesn't feel condemned or inadequate when they struggle to match the author's level of sudden, radical commitment? Because playing devil's advocate here, isn't the whole point to shock the reader out of their complacency?
Well, you don't want to dilute the destination, but you absolutely have to manage the incline of the journey. Think about the psychology of a novice reader. When someone who can barely bring themselves to pray for 5 minutes before work reads about an author locking himself in isolation for 3 months, they don't feel inspired.
They just feel condemned.
Right, they feel entirely inadequate. It triggers spiritual imposter syndrome. And when a reader feels like they can never measure up, they just close the book.
So how do we lower the barrier to entry without compromising the radical nature of those final steps?
The author needs to provide relatable perspectives and simple language examples to explain these complex biblical concepts. The goal is to create a practical, less intimidating roadmap for someone just starting their spiritual journey.
So we aren't removing the intense examples, we're just pacing them better.
Exactly. We are contextualizing them so the reader understands they don't have to fight the final boss on level 1.
That makes perfect sense. So what are the actual mechanics of slowing down that pacing in the manuscript?
There's a variety of ways the author could adjust this. But a very concrete action would be to take the profound wisdom currently found in Step 4, which is titled Walk the Life of Faith One Step at a Time, and move it to the very beginning of the manuscript as a framing device.
Wait, step 4 is currently right in the middle of the book? If you pull that out and put a massive disclaimer at the front door of a passionate manifesto, don't you risk killing the momentum right out of the gate? Usually you want to hook the reader with high stakes, not tell them to take it slow.
It won't kill the momentum if it's framed as an invitation rather than a warning. By moving that philosophy to the introduction, you ensure readers understand early on that they shouldn't immediately try to emulate the extreme, audacious examples of faith heroes like Kenneth Copeland, or even the author's own 3-month isolation.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah. It tells the reader, I am going to show you some crazy, radical acts of faith in this book, but you don't have to do them tomorrow. It gives the reader permission to just be a beginner.
Okay, I see the vision there. It's like a fitness trainer telling a new client, like, you're going to see me bench press 300 pounds today, but I only want you lifting the empty bar. It builds trust.
Precisely. And to build on that trust, another concrete step alongside moving that disclaimer would be to include more relatable, everyday scenarios for the earlier steps. Right now, the examples lean so heavily into the dramatic, like giving away cars or fighting off sudden, severe, life-threatening illnesses.
What does a more relatable example look like in the context of separating yourself from the world?
The author could blend in scenarios like dealing with intense frustration at a normal 9-to-5 job, or the anxiety of managing a small household budget when you barely have enough to make ends meet, rather than dealing with massive corporate financial attacks.
That really grounds the towering theology into the dirt of everyday life. So if step 1 is about separating yourself from the ties of this world, a beginner might relate far more to the struggle of not participating in toxic gossip at the office water cooler rather than the struggle of giving away a vehicle to a stranger.
Beautifully said. When you anchor the early steps in the mundane realities of daily life, the reader thinks, okay, I can actually do this. I can stop gossiping. And once they build that early confidence, they are much more willing to follow the author into the deeper, scarier waters of intense spiritual warfare later in the book.
It all comes back to the bridge analogy we started with. If you want the pedestrian to cross the river, the on-ramp has to start at ground level. If the first pillar of your bridge is 100 feet in the air, no one can even get on the walkway.
Exactly. And I think it's important to acknowledge how much courage it takes for an author to lay their entire spiritual journey out on the page like this. The anecdotes here are raw, they are personal, and they carry an undeniable electrical charge.
Oh, absolutely.
Our goal with this feedback isn't to dampen that electricity, but to wire the house properly so the reader doesn't get shocked when they turn on the light switch.
The raw power of the author's lived experience is undoubtedly the greatest asset this manuscript possesses. By tightening the structure, confronting the tonal paradoxes head-on, and creating a gentler on-ramp, this material has the potential to guide readers through a truly transformative experience. let's briefly recap the 3 main areas for improvement and summarize the actionable suggestions for the listener to implement. First, we discussed connecting the 7 steps into a cohesive structural progression from separation to reliance.
Right, so rather than leaving them as isolated ideas, Revisa transitions to explicitly link them. Make sure the text shows that the physical endurance built in Step 3 is the exact same spiritual discipline required to survive the prosperity of Step 5.
Second, we looked at resolving the tonal tension between material prosperity and spiritual surrender by clearly defining what it means to trust in God rather than riches.
Yeah. Tackle that paradox directly to prevent the reader from feeling baited and switched. Use the contrast between the auto body shop and the rich young ruler to clearly define the boundary between enjoying God's blessings and lusting after them.
And finally, we discussed softening the on-ramp for beginners so they don't feel overwhelmed by the rapid escalation into extreme faith actions.
Right. Giving the reader permission to pace themselves prevents spiritual imposter syndrome. Move the one-step-at-a-time philosophy to the introduction as a framing device, and pepper the early chapters with relatable, everyday examples like household budgets or workplace frustrations.
To our listener, thank you for submitting this deeply personal and thought-provoking material. We warmly invite you to apply these structural and tonal edits to your manuscript, and please submit your revised work back to the critique for further review. We would love to see how this evolves.